Evolutionists often claim that there is no evidence for a worldwide flood. But doesn't it seem a little coincidental that cultures separated by vast oceans or deserts around the world have flood stories? From the indigenous tribes of North America to the Middle East, we consistently find legends of floods and the few survivors who experienced them. With so many cultures recording this event, maybe scientists need to give their stories some consideration. I just had to investigate. For the sake of argument, let's just forget that episode 16 ever happened. Let's forget that flood geology can't explain how the layers we find in the earth alternate between dry and wet formation, or the appearance of what we call erratics. Let's forget that in episode 23 we re-established how a worldwide flood can't explain the intricacies of the Grand Canyon. Let's ignore the fact that in episode 14 we discovered that the most recent human common ancestor must have originated in sub-Saharan Africa, as opposed to somewhere between the mountains of Ararat and the junction of the Tigris and Euphrates. Let's also agree to forget arguments I'll be addressing in the future, like clams found fossilized and closed, fossils of animals found appearing to be panicked, or the appearance of oceanic fossils on the slopes of Mount Everest. Let's simply address what we know about civilization and how oral tradition works. We know that, to survive, humans need water. Even if they don't farm, the plants and animals they consume need a source of water too. It should be no surprise then to realize that nearly all cultures, and especially civilizations, settled on the banks and shores of bodies of water, be it a river, a lake, or an ocean. With that comes the inevitability that nearly every body of water eventually overflows, usually multiple times. In short, we know without any doubt that ancient people experienced floods. We also know that as stories are retold and subsequently passed on, the details of these stories change. As we discussed in episode 13, between 2012 and 2014, Donna J. Bridge published several papers in the Journal of Neuroscience detailing studies she performed to test the nuances of memory, and discovered that the human brain modifies a memory slightly each time it's recalled. For example, when a former athlete recalls their glory days, when a fisherman tells you about the one that got away, or even when your elders tell you how much tougher their lives were at your age. Whether we realize it or not, we do embellish our stories. Many creationists cite the similarities of flood stories around the world. One of the most popular creationist websites presents a graph to visually represent those similarities across 35 cultures. Of the 35 cultures they cite, 35 of them detail destruction by water. This seems fairly obvious when comparing flood stories. Of the 35 of them detail human survivors, which also seems obvious because someone would have to survive. The story is to survive. 32 of them describe a vessel rescuing the survivors, leaving the Peruvian and Zoroastrian stories depicting survivors running to the mountains, and the Polynesian story having a fisherman seek shelter on an island until the flood recedes. 24 of them feature animals being spared from the destruction, which necessarily means that the other 11 stories could not have been about worldwide floods. 18 of the accounts include a divine cause for the flood, and in 17 of these accounts the humans received warning, but were only divinely warned in 7. On the same site is another chart comparing 20 flood stories with comparable similarities, but there are some notable differences. Of the 20, only 6 of them describe the survivors as religiously faithful. Only 5 stories describe the survivors landing on a mountain, and only 5 stories feature the survivors rescuing animals, once again meaning the others couldn't have been worldwide floods. In both tables, only the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh matches all of the details that the website chose to compare. Strangely, the Epic of Gilgamesh was committed to writing at least a few centuries before the Book of Genesis, and it is known to be an embellishment of Atrahasis before it. Of course, just because Gilgamesh was written before Genesis doesn't mean that the Genesis account wasn't passed on via oral tradition before it. But if the Genesis flood is the original account, and all other stories stem from the same 8 people, we should expect the accounts to contain nearly all of those details, or more exaggerated versions. What is most notably off about the stories featuring vessels to save the survivors? Only the stories from around the Middle East describe an ark. Contrary to popular depictions, an ark is not a sea craft. It is by definition a box. Sometimes it can be fancy, but it is still a box. This seems to be an odd detail to leave out of subsequent retellings. More or less half of the stories aren't even about worldwide floods. In fact, reading Genesis in the original Hebrew, it also may not be describing a worldwide flood. Checking in any concordance, you can see that the Hebrew word eretz is usually used in the Bible to refer to a nation or a large parcel of land. In fact, the actual Hebrew name for Israel is Eretz Israel. The fact that different cultures describe a large destructive flood is no surprise. In fact, the most common myth around the globe for ancient cultures is of the sun passing over it. In nearly all of them, including the Bible, there is an account of the sun stopping in the sky or even falling to earth. In reality, if the sun ever appeared to stop, it would be due to the earth's rotation stopping. Now that would cause a destructive worldwide flood. But none of us would experience it because we would all suddenly find ourselves flying due east at 465 meters per second. Obviously, the commonality of ancient accounts is a weak argument for their validity. This is why science doesn't make arguments by simply citing stories. Science is done by making observations of the real world and then, after positing an explanation for what is observed, testing those explanations to see if they predict future observations. Ancient stories simply can't do that. Now, if you got a little sick of hearing me reference earlier chapters in the course of this video, it's important to understand that all branches of science have a degree of overlap, and the worldwide flood story just happens to exist in a juncture where nearly all of them meet and find it lacking. Another example of how creationism taught me real science. Learn more about the real science behind other creationist arguments by watching other episodes. If there's a creationist argument you think I should investigate, please comment below. It may be the subject of a later video. In the meantime, subscribe and make sure you don't miss it.